My name is Shaun Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs here at Georgetown University. I really don't feel like I need to introduce Ben Rhodes. There are already people walking up to him on the street saying, "Aren't you Ben Rhodes?" So I don't think identity is a problem here. We're here to talk about Ben's book, The World as It Is. I think it's coming out in paperback edition. We have a volume still, I think, on sale if you haven't had a chance to pick one up. But welcome to everyone. And we're just going to jump in, and probably at the halfway mark, we'll pivot to the audience for your Q&A. So please be thinking about your questions, and we'll have microphones roaming when we get to that. First of all, you've written a great book, which is not always the case when people leave administrations.
Yeah,
I've read
a low bar.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a lot of dreck out there, but this is definitely not that, which is very exciting. Let me begin with the question, if you could tell us a little bit, Ben, about your pilgrimage towards public service. Where were you? What was it that happened? And why did you decide that this is something you wanted to do at a very early age?
Well, first of all, thanks for hosting me here, Shaun, and Jeff DeLaurentis, one of my favorite people in government, or both of you. And so, you know, I always, particularly when I'm talking to students, you know, when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. So like some people who were like that, I went to graduate school. And I was actually getting a master's degree in fiction writing. And if I'd known how much grief I'd get from the Republican Party about that over the next 20 years of my life, I would never have done that. But, you know, it's kind of sorting it out. But I thought I was going to be a writer. But I also always had a political interest. So I was working on a city council campaign on September 11th. And I had this kind of unobstructed view of the second plane hitting and the first tower collapsing. And I remember having to walk home because the subways were shut down, and cell phone service was down, and I had no idea the scale of the catastrophe. I knew people who worked in that area. I didn't know if they were okay. And I remember just thinking that whatever I was going to do going forward was going to be connected to the response to this event. That, you know, sitting in my apartment in Queens and writing short stories about a guy living in an apartment in Queens trying to be a writer was no longer the thing to do. So I came down to Washington. I wanted to kind of get into journalism, and somebody that I interviewed with recommended that, well, if you want to write about foreign policy and learn about it, if you consider being a speechwriter, because he knew this guy, Lee Hamilton, who needed a speechwriter. And I had not thought about that. I think most people don't consider becoming a speechwriter. And but I took that job, and I guess the point I'd make is that, you know, when I look back on it, it's this kind of pretty big chance. I was 24 and just decided to pick up and move to a different city and then go into a profession that I'd never thought about going into. And then I worked for him for 5 years, and then I took another chance to go work for Barack Obama's campaign, because one of the things I'd learned working for Hamilton, you know, he was the co-chair of the 9/11 Commission and the co-chair of the Iraq Study Group, and we prepared these reports about what should be done. And I realized that if the people in charge didn't change, that you could write all the best reports in the world. And so then I wanted to go do something about that. And Barack Obama was coming along, and here's this guy who's different, and he opposed the war in Iraq, which is what had angered me. And I guess the point is that if I had set out to work in the White House, I never would have worked in the White House. I set out to learn things and do things, and to work for people I admired, and that led me in directions that brought me to the White House. And so it was that impulse to be a part of the events that were going to shape my life that was most important, and just following a path of things that were interesting and important to me led me to places I never thought I would go.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think comes across in the book, too, that once you got in the Obama orbit, there was sort of an organized passion there. It wasn't just another step on a career path leading to some cushy foreign policy job when you got to be 50 or 60.
Nobody, and I really believed this at the time. When I went to work for Barack Obama in 2007, I was 29, and I was probably one of the oldest people on that campaign at that time. And I literally do not think a single person in that headquarters was thinking about what job they would have if Barack Obama won. Yeah. And that's why that campaign worked. It also showed us, when he won the Iowa caucus, we were like, you know, holy crap. This is us. Politics is us. There's not like some Wizard of Oz who determines who the next president is or who the next member of Congress is. Like, if you're organized and you get involved, like, then the government becomes you. You know, I mean, it's little. And Barack Obama would tell you this, that it was literally just a few hundred young people that won him the Iowa caucus that propelled him to the presidency. Well, and a lot of money, but that he had to raise. But the young people raised the money, you know. So I think people have more agency in our democracy than they sometimes think they do. But again, they're more effective if they care. And if you're trying to win because you want a job, people can smell that a mile away. If they see passion, you know, people recognize it and they believe it's authentic.
So I think that's a really important analogy to 2019. I mean, we have a lot of students here in the School of Foreign Service who I think began thinking about doing something like what you did or working in that arena, and there was the Obama administration that had done all these innovative things, and then suddenly not. So what counsel would you give to a 20-year-old junior School of Foreign Service major who right now is wondering, is it worth continuing pursuing my passion and justice in a new order, or do I just look for a master's degree in novel writing or something?
Yeah.
What
Don't get a master's degree in novel writing, first of all. I guess I'd say, you know, two things. One about the state of like politics in our world, and then one about the specific circumstance of this junior. The first of all, and this is a partisan view, obviously, but things seem pretty bleak. Things seem really dark, and they are. And I think what is most dangerous and upsetting in our country and the world right now is that these authoritarian nationalist figures appear to have the wind at their backs. You know, whether it's Donald Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or literally a Nazi party in parliament in Germany, which is never good, or Duterte in the Philippines, or Putin in Russia, or Netanyahu in Israel. You know, go on down the list. But what I will say is that this story of authoritarian nationalism, it's the oldest story in the book. Blame other people, us versus them brand of politics. And it always leads to very bad things. It always leads usually to very big wars. But what it depends upon is cynicism and apathy. There is not majority support for this in our country. There's frankly not majority support for this really in any Western country. If you look at places where they get footholds, it's never with the majority. It's in through the door of minority government. And so what they depend upon is for young people in particular to give up and to think that I can't change this, or politics is too broken, or you know, I'm just going to go do X. And that mentality is very dangerous because it's what they rely upon. So the first thing is to not give up your agency to those forces. They want you grinded down. They want you exhausted by the tweets. They want you exhausted by the negativity. Don't let that happen. The more concrete thing I'd say is there's a lot of ways to make a difference. Yes, you can go work on a political campaign. You can go work for an NGO. You know, you can become a journalist. You can become a foreign service officer. One of the fascinating experiences I had in government is I had a team, you know, people that I worked with, and I ended up having a lot of foreign service officers, some military officers. You know, we were just talking about this, and we were all about the same age, and everybody had had a similar 9/11 experience. But then, you know, I'd come into politics. Some of these people had gone into the foreign service. Some of these people had signed up for the military. And then you meet people who started NGOs. Like, there are many different ways for you to do things. If you follow the things that you care about, you will find things that you can work on. You're at Georgetown. You're smart. Like, you'll be employed. Don't worry. Think about what you want to do, not necessarily what you want to be.
Yeah. So one of the things you talk about early on, and at one point you say you had this sort of symbolic chip on your shoulder because you were not a foreign policy establishment insider. In some ways, neither was President Obama in that sense. I mean, he'd become a senator, but he had not worked his way up through kind of the Washington bureaucracy. And maybe I'm overinterpreting here, but I think there's a subtext in your book that says that's a good thing to have non-blob members, to use a famous phrase, inside the actual foreign policy apparatus of the government so that it's not sort of a company town, if you will, but to have people with different viewpoints who don't necessarily have the credentials to be part of the establishment.
Yeah, so I think that there's a structural piece to this, and then there's a more meta piece. The structural piece is there are ways in which some of the national security establishment in this country are wired that I find to be troubling. To take a very prominent example, because what I was talking about with the blob, it was largely this repeated impulse towards military intervention in ex-Middle Eastern country, and it keeps changing. But what you find underneath the hood is the influence of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, for instance, prominently. And they have very specific interests that they would like the United States to act upon. And they spend millions of dollars in lobbying, and they spend millions of dollars in think tanks. And oh, by the way, if I was friendly towards their interests when I was in government, I'll probably get like a $50,000 paid speaking opportunity in Abu Dhabi the first year I'm out. And I may get a very lucrative seat on a corporate board. I mean, this is all staring everybody right in the face. And actually, one of the benefits of the Trump administration is it's literally staring us in the face. The corruption of this, right. the corrupting influence of money, right? And people, good people who are well-intentioned, I'm not saying everybody's corrupt, but it seeps in, just the, frankly, the way in which if you take certain positions, you're thinking, well, 10 years from now, will I be able to make it through a Senate confirmation, if I'm critical of the Israeli government, am I going to put that at risk? They're weird incentives that do feed certain types of behaviors, and caution in some respects, and kind of inertia in other respects. So that's a structural piece. I think the broader piece of this is the ability to question underlying assumptions from time to time. We were just talking about this with some students. Cuba is the other example, which is when I came into government, I thought this Cuba policy is crazy. We've tried this for 60 years and it doesn't work. And if you talk to experts, there's nobody who would really dispute this. The reason that you didn't try to change Cuba policy was just kind of like because you don't try to change Cuba policy. There's some powerful people in Congress who will give you a hard time. There's some powerful interests in Florida that will make a lot of noise. And there was just this kind of acceptance of a status quo that didn't make any sense, right? And the ability to step outside of that status quo and say, but this doesn't make any sense, so we should do something to change this. That was a mindset that Obama could bring to bear and say to me, go make as much change as you can in negotiating this, right? And that's an outsider perspective that I think is useful to say, just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean we can't question that underlying assumption and do it differently. And so I always tried to maintain that outsider skepticism, frankly, of certain aspects of US foreign policy so that the potential to change the direction of the ocean liner of American foreign policy was available. And so there are, I think, both some structural issues that need to be sorted out about why it is that certain countries are so influential in our foreign policy, and their impulses usually to get us to intervene on their behalf, and also why it is that we sometimes don't do enough to step back and question the direction of things.
And I think it's interesting, too, in the book you talk about it. I think it was at the beginning of the second term where the president asks you, are there particular projects you want to add to your portfolio? And allowed you to say, Cuba is one, and he said, Cuba is, in a sense, yours to begin to push on. That's not a very establishment. I mean, he didn't turn to somebody who'd been on the Council of Foreign Relations for staff for 30 years who was a Cuba expert to do that.
Yeah, but what we did is I was going to lead the Cuba negotiation. But look, I was not the biggest expert on Cuba. So we took the best expert we could find, a guy named Ricardo Zuniga, and made him my partner. And then I had certain things, Ricardo knew a lot of things about Cuba that I didn't know, but I had certain things that I could do that Ricardo couldn't do because I was very close to Obama. And the Cubans were going to value most of all that person was kind of 1 degree removed from the president. And frankly, because I wasn't a traditional diplomat, I could do certain things differently. So the first meeting I had with Alejandro Castro in June of 2013, we sit down, And after exchanging some pleasantries, I got the 3-hour speech about the Bay of Pigs invasion, about attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, about Cuban-American efforts to sabotage the Cuban government, CIA efforts across Latin America, most of which was true, by the way. But I got the full complaint. And I think a normal diplomat, I mean, Jeff, can correct me if I'm wrong, would almost be compelled to at least debate, if not debate those things, say, well, but we have all these concerns about the Cuban government. Right. And I was able to sit there and think about, well, how am I going to respond to this? And I finally said, when he's done, which took a while, I said, look, Alejandro, I wasn't even born when most of this stuff happened. Number one. Right. Number two, I understand and I respect that this history is important to you. I'm not here to argue with you about this history, and I respect that it matters to you. But I'm here because I work for a different kind of American president than all the American presidents that were part of this history, and he wants me to be looking forward. And so I could say that in a way that nobody who was at the State Department could, and that's not a shot at the State Department, it's just the reality that I could break out of a certain convention precisely because of the non-traditional nature of who I was. And then, frankly, having Ricardo that whole time, he could point out, well, here's why they're raising this, or here's what you need to know about this, or well, maybe you shouldn't have said it that way. And, say, and so it took both of us. Right. It wouldn't have worked without both of us.
Right. Yeah, in our shop, we call that playing the piñata. Like when we went into the Muslim world, the first thing we would get hit with is, well, you guys invaded and destroyed Iraq. And but it was great to say, but our president actually got elected.
Yeah.
Opposing that. But I hear you, and I think a lot of the State Department career folk are like, you don't bring that. No. Yeah. You have to defend American historical policy.
Yeah. And that's been I think it presents a difficult challenge on there's a reason why we have, what's interesting is if you look at Cuba and Iran in particular, there's something about the psychology of American foreign policy. That if there's a country that embarrasses us, for some reason we have a hard time moving on from that.
Right.
And at the same time, you have to wonder, why do we have to be bound by history? I think the other thing that's important in dealing with some of these countries is we tend to think of any authoritarian country as like a monolithic. So every single member of the Cuban Communist Party must be the same. Every single member of the Iranian establishment must be the same. And what I found is they're just as diverse as any other country. Frankly, the more I talk to the Cubans, the more I realize that Fidel and Raul Castro don't agree about things. And they're brothers, right? And there are these interesting factions inside of Cuba. And frankly, I wish we had more diplomats there because then we'd understand more what those factions are. And then once Jeff went down there, we had an ambassador, we learned a lot more. And so I think sometimes we have to be willing to not just revisit our assumptions of our policies, but look at places as the complex living organisms and collections of human beings that they are.
Well, we're speaking about Cuba. Can you say a little bit more about the Vatican role in your interaction with various sort of global Catholic leaders, and what role did they play in the change of policy?
Well, we had an idea from early on that the Vatican could play some role. And then what Ricardo and I decided was what we would need is a third party, that the U.S. and Cuba don't fully trust each other, even if we get along well with our interlocutors. So that each party could feel assured that the other side would keep their commitments, the Vatican could kind of play this role. And that, frankly, if the Vatican played that role, it could help build support in both the United States and Cuba for what we're doing, because it's a respected institution in both countries. And Obama, we teed Obama up to talk to Pope Francis about this in March of 2014. And we were already pretty far into the negotiations. And so they had a long talk about Cuba. Francis very much wanted to help. So he sent a letter essentially offering to help, that the Cuban Cardinal Ortega, who is close to Francis, could deliver in person to both Obama and Raul Raul Castro. And then it was kind of, ball was in our court. And so then we arranged to go to the Vatican in October of 2014 to finalize the agreement. So we actually negotiated all the agreements, and we were going to essentially finalize them, present them, and deposit them at the Vatican. The interesting thing is that the Vatican doesn't do business on email, really, which is actually a really good idea in retrospect. I wish we had had some of that. So they actually didn't know how far we'd come. So I'll never forget coming into the Vatican, like you're in St. Peter's, like everybody else, and we come in, Ricardo and I, and the Cubans meet with the Secretary of State of the Vatican, Cardinal Parolin, first. Right. And then we went in second. And this guy looked kind of stunned. And he'd been in Venezuela, he knew Latin America. Yes. And he says to me, "Are you really normalizing relations with Cuba and opening embassies and all these things?" And I said, "Yes." And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, "Who are you?" And I was like, "I'm Ben Rhodes." And he said, "Does John Kerry know about this?" And I had to we had to explain to him what the NSC is and all this stuff, but then what was very powerful is we went into this ornate room with, some tapestry from, 1,000 years ago on the wall, and we had to read aloud all the agreements. And we had 7 different documents that we all had to read aloud because the Vatican's very formal. But it was actually very powerful to read the words. Right. The United States commits to normalize relations with Cuba. And I remember while I was doing this, a number of people on the Vatican side teared up, and people who'd worked in Cuba. And I remember Cardinal Parolin coming up to me after and saying to me, "This will give people hope." And I said, "Yes, we hope that the American-Cuban people can move past it." And he says, "No, not the American-Cuban people. Like, this will give people around the world hope if former adversaries can reconcile." And you got this sense of the moral component of the Vatican involvement, that there are certain things that are bigger than even the relations among nations, and the principle that adversaries can reconcile through dialogue, and that there's a common humanity on different sides of borders. That was very present in the room when we were there. And then I think having Pope Francis as the guarantor of this agreement, given his standing, made it much more powerful when we announced it. So I think the Vatican was essential. And I would say that even when we got the letter from Pope Francis, that broke a couple of log jams in our negotiations. So, they didn't negotiate it, they didn't put the agreement together, but having their weight behind it was very important.
Several months after that, I was coming to the Vatican, and one of our embassy staffers there told me that there was actually more Vatican talent and expertise on Cuba in their diplomatic corps based in Rome than maybe in any other point in the history of the modern papacy. Yeah, because Francis was, from Argentina, because Parolin had been, I think, Archbishop in Venezuela, they were just, everybody I met in that meeting had lived in Cuba at some point and knew it very well. And because the Vatican has put a lot of effort into building up since Pope John Paul went, its presence in Cuba, because they recognize, as we did, that Cuba is an entry, it's a doorway to Latin America. Right. Cuba is a lot more important than just Cuba. Cuba stands for something big. By the way, not just in Latin America. I remember going to the African Union with President Obama, and when he mentioned Cuba, anywhere he went in Africa, after the opening, the place would go crazy. The role of Cuba in the imagination of Africa, because of where they stood on apartheid. I remember, well, I don't want to go into too much, but, I was going to say, I remember, Jeff and I were the only 2 Americans at Fidel Castro's funeral. And, well, actually, not American officials. I was on this dais, and Harry Belafonte and Danny Glover were there. But I remember actually the most powerful speech was given by the president of Namibia, right? Because because the Cubans had helped them fight for independence, and he said the Cubans are the only ones who helped liberate us and never asked for anything in return. And there's a lot of bad things to say about this current Cuban government, but one thing that they were on the right side of some of that. So you're 10, 11 months into the book's release into the world, and now the paperback is coming out. when a book comes out, you get different waves of reactions, and I'm curious, of all the, I'm not asking you to sort of tell us everything, but what have been the most surprising responses that you've noted from any party, any quarter, to the book itself?
You know, I think the most interesting reaction, that what's been very interesting about a book tour is that people outside of Washington, and we're obviously in Washington now, but first of all, the most consistent thing I heard positively was about the personal story. And I don't know what it's like to be in this job, and I don't know what it's like to balance, you know, I write about like what's it like to have a marriage and be in the White House, or I don't want to, right. And the curiosity that people had about public service, and the sincere and kind of earnest desire to know more, and the feeling that you detect that people feel like they're not getting that from the media, that there's this kind of triviality to the way things are portrayed that doesn't really reach them. I think that the difficult thing for me is to answer the question specifically, is so much is colored by obviously the Trump phenomenon, right? And so people like observe this as some like ancient history document, and so people wanting to figure out where things are going to go. I'll tell you, like, one of the most interesting reactions though I had was that I've had similar reactions on the book tour, but it's an interesting story to tell. While I was writing the book, I used to go every now and then to West Virginia. There was and yes, this is going to be a talking to a Trump voter in West Virginia. But I used to go to this kind of old inn, bed and breakfast kind of place in Harper's Ferry. I liked to go in the winter because it was empty and cheap. And so I was the only person staying in this house. And the woman cooking breakfast kept asking me who I was and what I did, and I didn't want to tell her who I was because I can't tell she was probably a Trump voter in West Virginia. And one of the things I was wrestling with in the book is the experience of being this kind of villainized figure by the right wing. And she's a very nice person, but clearly, and I told her I used to work in government, and I was writing about it. And so she starts talking about politics and Trump person, and then she says that she voted for Obama, but then she started doing research. And did I know that George Soros was the devil? And it's getting worse and worse. And then she says to me, "And do you know about Benghazi?" And I was standing there. I was like, "This is interesting," because she doesn't know who I am. And so I was like, "Why don't we go in the other room and talk about Benghazi?"
Wow.
And because I'd really like to know. And so we sat down, and actually I ended up having this 45-minute conversation with her where I said, "What do you think happened in Benghazi?" And she's like, "Well, they lied, and they all lied about it." And I was like, "Well, no, actually there was this video." And she's like, "They made up the video." I'm like, "Well, there was a video." And I was like, but then I said, like, even if you think that some people lied, like, why? What were they covering up, And, well, there was a stand-down order. And we went through the whole thing, and I was able to kind of say, well, no, actually, like, this is what... And she could kind of figure out over time that I seem to know a lot about Benghazi. And it finally reached the end of the conversation where she kind of said, well, if nothing bad happened, then why are all these former Special Forces guys on Fox who say that it did? Which was kind of the core of the issue. And I said to her, well, you don't like that George Soros spends a lot of money to make people think something, in your opinion. I mean, I obviously have a better opinion of did you think that maybe a bunch of people spent a lot of money on Benghazi, And then, so we finished the conversation. I said to her, I said, look, I'm a character in the story, and you probably won't like me if you knew who I was. And she goes, no, you're such a nice young man and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, I'm just telling you this. So the next morning I wake up, and I can hear her downstairs, and I'm like, oh boy, I don't know if I want to go downstairs, because I knew she would have figured out who I am. And so I went downstairs, and she was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. If I'd known who you were, I never would have said all those things to you. And I was like, no, I've actually never been able to talk to a human being beyond the hate messages and death threats I get. You know, like, I didn't put it that way, but
Right.
and she's like, but you're so nice, and you're not Ben Rhodes that I've read about. And I'm like, yeah,
Thank you.
I'm not. Like, that person is not a real person, you know? And I did have this experience from some people who read the book and were like, well, I never thought about, you know, what, you know, and I wanted to tell that. So that's been, you know, the most heartening thing is occasionally like reintroducing myself as a human being and not as the cartoon character of myself on the right or the left, for that matter, has been the best experience.
So I gave a midterm exam this semester, and there's some guilty students out here. And one of the questions was, is Obama a Niebuhrian? And being Georgetown students, the essay came back yes, no, and maybe. So it was. But one of the things I want to ask about, which you shed a lot of light on, I think, in the book, is Obama's conception of exceptionalism. Now, that's sort of a booby trap in American political rhetoric today, because you have to say, yes, I am, or you know, hell rains down on you. But you paint a pretty nuanced picture that for Obama, that doesn't mean God created a new Israel back when the Puritans landed in Massachusetts. So could you say more about your elaboration of his deeper, more robust understanding of what American exceptionalism means to him?
So to try to connect it quickly to Niebuhr, you know, human beings have the capacity to do good and the capacity to do evil. Mm-hmm. Those impulses are present in every human and in every country, right? Mm-hmm. America has done incredibly good things and incredibly bad things. The definition of exceptionalism. So what makes America exceptional? You know, Obama used to get criticized for apologizing for America and all the rest of it. Right. The point that I would always make is Obama's definition of American exceptionalism is that the way in which America was organized, our founding documents, allowed for the continued betterment of America, the ability to right historical wrongs, the ability to extend rights to people who had previously been denied them, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the workers' rights movement, the gay rights movement, the welcoming of immigrants. It's a very progressive view of American exceptionalism. I remember he gave a speech in Selma where he gives a kind of list of heroes of American history. And it's kind of I love it because it's Jackie Robinson and it's Sojourner Truth. And it's all the people who got left out of the history books for too long. But what makes us exceptional is our ability to improve ourselves. We have a democracy that gives space for lots of different people to come together and make things better. We weren't still born perfectly out of the heads of the founding fathers, such that every single thing we did after that was going to be right. No, what's exceptional about us is our ability to improve ourselves. By the way, the same thing is true in our foreign policy, and some of the things I'm most proud of, like Cuba, were about trying to right what I thought were historical wrongs. And so, to me, that's a profoundly patriotic idea. And what Obama was able to do that I think any progressive politician, you know, how do you have a progressive message that can resonate with a lot of Americans is he would acknowledge flaws, but in a deeply patriotic way, and say, like, we're a country that had these flaws but could improve upon them. And he, you know, he'd get criticized. He wasn't apologizing. He was actually saying about what made him so proud to be American, that we had this history that we were able to overcome. And so that was very much his view, that we had to learn from a past that allowed us to correct imperfections and to acknowledge that we're not perfect now, and we have to continue to get better.
So let me maybe close, and we'll pivot to the audience here in a second. You did run a short list there, really innovative, amazing policy changes. You know, Iran. I mean, yeah, the Iran nuclear deal, getting us out of Iraq. Of all of those, which at the end of the day, what are the ones you think, just from your own personal perspective, whether you worked on them or not, what are the greatest foreign policy achievements of the Obama administration?
Well, look, I think that there's a list of achievements, right, and most of which have been aimed at. But I would say that in addition to Iran and Cuba and a whole host of other things, if you look at the Paris Agreement, the reason the Paris Agreement I think is so important, and by the way, the next U.S. president will re-enter the Paris Agreement on the first day, so it's the one I actually know will endure. The reason it's so important is obviously, first and foremost, it's the architecture within which the world will deal with climate change, right? So we have to improve upon it, but it was built in a way that allows for continued improvement and allows for nations to periodically enhance their ambition and to kind of create this effort outside of governments to marshal new technologies. And I won't dwell on that, but the other reason it's important is it's the kind of international order that we need to have. We no longer live in a world in which the G7 countries can solve things. We live in a world in which China and India need to be profound stakeholders in the international system, where every country has a role to play. And Paris is the first agreement of its kind where literally everybody is in it right now except for us. 200 countries are in this agreement, and they all have a differentiated commitment within a common architecture. And the reason I think that's such an important foreign policy achievement is not just a climate change aspect. We need a Paris Agreement for migration. We need, in this world today, we need a Paris Agreement probably for the uses of certain technologies. It's a model for a truly 21st century international order that doesn't look like the UN Security Council, but that looks like the actual world that we live in, right? So to me, Paris is about a much bigger message that the whole world can come together to do something. And climate change is obviously the most important thing that the world has to do. I think beyond that, you think about legacy a lot when your legacy is being dismantled. But the honest truth of that is, and I was talking about this in the last session, what I'm most proud of is also what are all the people around the world who were inspired in some way by Barack Obama? What are they going to do? Obama and I used to have this thing when we get cynical at the end of the administration. He'd say, remember that girl in Laos. And what he meant by that is I talked to him about there's a young girl, or young woman, I'm middle-aged now, so if you're 22, it's a young woman, who came to an exchange program that we set up, came to the United States to study waste management, right? And studied in like Montana or something. I met her when I went to Laos, and she was in some roundtable we had, and she said, yeah, I was going to come to the United States and stay. And get a job there. And she's like, but then I heard Obama say something about the need to improve your communities, and I decided to go back, and now she would set up a network of villages along the Mekong River that were providing clean water to those villages. And when I told Obama that, he's like, yeah, that's the whole point of politics. Think of how many people there are like her, and we don't even know what they're going to do. And that to me is an incredibly hopeful thought that, and it made me think that, look, my political hero was John F. Kennedy. And I couldn't sit here today and tell you I couldn't tell you 5 laws he passed or 5 foreign policy accomplishments. I can tell you that I probably went into politics in part because of him. So everything I did is a part of his legacy. And there's probably hundreds of millions of people that he impacted in that way. And I think Obama's one of those people. I see the incoming Democratic House majority, and it looks like a 2008 Obama campaign rally. It's younger, it's more diverse. I see multiple African-American candidates and people of color running for president. Like, all of this feels like part of what I was trying to be a part of. And that ultimately is more important even than any one accomplishment.
Fantastic. So let's pivot now. We got these Klieg lights in our eyes, so I'm going to do the sort of stare. We have microphones roaming, I assume. And so let me give you the ground rules. Number 1, ask a question, or disguise your sermon as a question. If you want to learn how to preach sermons, come see me. There's schools where you can go and do that. The School of Foreign Service is not one of those. And the more quick questions we get, the more people will get to ask quick questions. So when the microphone comes to you, tell us who you are, what institution you're from. So why don't we start at the front, and we got 2 microphones? Yes. All right, so why don't we have the second microphone, finding somebody in the back. So please.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes, for coming tonight. I'm a big fan of Pod Save the World and Crooked Media, so thank you. I'm a recently graduated master's student from UNC, currently interning with the Hudson Institute. And I wanted to ask you...
Your name? Tell us who you are.
Oh, Kate Rouleau.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about tie it into your last answer. Could you talk about what progressive policies we should be expecting from the Democratic candidates in terms of foreign policy in 2020, 2021? What should the U.S. be doing to help lead the world?
Yeah. The first thing is I think we have to understand that the most powerful thing that we can do is to get our own example in better shape. You know, if you talk to people around the world, the biggest tool of support for democratic values around the world is when we are living them effectively at home. Respect for the rule of law and independent media and civil society. So actually there's a connection between that and what we do around the world. And I'd like to see a progressive articulate the connection between how we will invest in those things here, but also kind of revitalize our commitment to those things overseas. I think obviously these candidates should be putting forward, as some of them are, in my view, the necessity of bringing to some form of end the permanent war that we've been in multiple countries. I think there should be a termination of the legal authority that currently governs our military operations and a replacement of that with something that is much more narrow, coupled with, I think, a reduction in our military footprint in many parts of the world. I think I'd like to hear the articulation of what does it mean for climate change to be treated as it should be, which is as the single most important national security issue of our lifetime. The idea that we organize the entire US government around fighting terrorism, a few thousand people, or maybe a few tens of thousands of people, when we have literally a threat that implicates every single national security interest we have, that makes no sense to me. And I'd like to see what does that mean in practice. If we have a $900 billion defense budget, I would like to see a significant chunk of that repurposed to, in some fashion, fighting climate change. If you're talking about what is an existential threat to this country, if you're talking about how do you want to fund the Green New Deal, the $1 trillion nuclear modernization plan that we have, I'd like to see a chunk of that dedicated to climate change. So I'd like to see real answers on what does it mean to resource a global effort to hypercharge the transition to a clean energy economy in our country, but also around the world. I'd like to see us revisit, in the same way we've revisited our Cuba policy, certain relationships. The US-Saudi relationship is a deeply corrupting one, and it's time to rethink all of it. Why are we providing military assistance to a government like this? Why are we supporting a series of foreign policies across the Middle East that are destabilizing? And then I think I'd like to hear the articulation of a foreign policy that puts people at the center of it again, that's about supporting people around the world. And you know, what does that mean in terms of assistance? But what does that mean I look at a problem like Venezuela, that is being treated as a regime change policy and not as a policy of trying to support the Venezuelan people who are in a very difficult circumstance. So I think that, I won't go on beyond that, but I think that we should expect to get a sense of what it means, not just to say we're for strong alliances and being respected, but what are some of the core components of that?
Let's take a question from the back, and then maybe we can move to the back over here for this third question.
Hi, my name is Julia Friedman. I'm a senior here at the School of Foreign Service, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about kind of the confrontation with the blob, and how when you're speaking truth to power, you're not only dealing with an individual who represents that power, you're also dealing with an entire bureaucracy that has kind of a momentum in favor of one specific policy position or one specific policy philosophy. And so when you're taking that on, I was wondering what your strategies, your primary strategies were.
Yeah. So my strategies, the success of them were mixed. I think that within the position I was in, I definitely wanted to signal and I wrestled with this in the book because I actually don't know whether it was right or wrong when I look back on it. I think it was right, but then I probably overdid it. a lot of the reason why certain things aren't done is fear. People are afraid of change. Or you could find the fact that like a lot of people in the government agreed with what we wanted to do with Iran, or agreed with what we wanted to do on Cuba, but didn't want to be out in front on it because they were worried about the risk of it. Put it this way, if you have a career in foreign policy and government, and you're thinking about, and I kind of alluded to this before, what are the things that if I touch, I'm probably going to have trouble in my Senate confirmation down the line? Like Iran and Cuba are pretty high on that list, right? And I knew that. I knew that heading into the second term. And so my strategy was that I could kind of be a leader in a way if I like literally pulled the pin out of the grenade and jumped on it myself and had it explode on me, to try to show people we don't need to be afraid. We can take on these fights. Like, charge up the hill with me here, guys. You know, it's okay. You know, and I'll be the lightning rod on this. But in terms of within bureaucracies, I do think that, and I may have overdone that at times, but I do think that like you do need to signal, because one of the things I recognized, actually, particularly when I left, is some of the people who'd followed me up the hill got fired by the Trump people, or the Trump people went after them. I felt pretty bad about that. And what I realized is like, the reason they were afraid is because they knew they were going to be there after I left, right? And but when I asked them, none of them regret it, or at least they tell me they don't. But I do think you need to indicate, if you are challenging convention, that you yourself are willing to pay a price, that you yourself are willing to engage in a debate, that you're not going to push this down on somebody else below you to suffer the incoming. That was my approach. I mean, the reason I paused for a long time is like I still to this day don't know if that was necessarily right or not, but that was definitely my approach. That they needed to see from the top down that we were willing to fight for these things, and that they should feel willing to fight for them too. And that's how ultimately bureaucracies change.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question over here. Can we grab someone? Just right there.
Hi, Ben. My name is Casey. I a graduate from the University of Oregon, and now I work for the Navy as an intelligence officer. And my question is, it concerns the Trans-Pacific Partnership and China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And I'm wondering, do you see this as a zero-sum game between China and the United States, or is this something that we can cope with? Obviously, the Trump administration has not pursued the TPP. Yeah. I'm wondering if an administration afterwards, if it's feasible to join something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not a zero-sum game, but here's how I describe it. And it's funny when people ask the walking away from TPP is actually, I think, probably from a geostrategic thing, the most damaging thing that the Trump administration has done. And here's why. I had a particular responsibility for Southeast Asia at the end of the administration. And I remember I talked to a Vietnamese official, and he'd say, we've hated the Chinese for 1,000 years, but we know they're going to be here for the next 1,000 years. And we don't know if you're all going to be here. And TPP is the only indication that you are. And you'd hear a version of this everywhere. And hate is a strong word. He meant that they're kind of rivals and, I don't hate the Chinese. I don't want to suggest it's a zero-sum kind of, but the point is that Belt Road, there's things about that are concerning to all the countries in it. And I know because I've talked to them. It's essentially a plan in which everybody has to sign on the dotted line to China's terms. And so, yeah, they get some infrastructure, but you go into debt to China, and you probably maybe have to pay a bribe to somebody. And the terms aren't good, but they are predictable. Everybody knows the price, everybody knows the deal, and the thing about the Chinese is it never changes. They stick to the terms. Meanwhile, we're doing this, and so they're looking at us and saying, you know what? we better make our deal with the Chinese. And so since we pulled out TPP and since Trump came in, every one of these countries is just saying, these guys are nuts, and we better just make the deal with China now. And I'm not just talking about Southeast Asia. I think this is probably happening with the South Koreans and the Japanese to some extent, and a host of other, all Africa and Latin America. And so to me, it's not that TPP was supposed to like beat China or zero something. It was to show like, well, here's an alternative way of arranging commerce that has some protections for, that has access to the highest quality markets in the world, that has some protections for intellectual property, that has some protections for the environment, that has some protections for the people who are actually doing the work, and that if we can show that this works, it's not a direct competition. Belt Road happens, this happens too, but hopefully there are more people who want to be part of this club. And TPP had Vietnam and Singapore and Malaysia in it, and ultimately I think if it had gone forward, you'd have Indonesia coming into it and the Philippines, maybe even China one day, right? And so this is how we view China generally. We don't want to keep China down. We want China to continue to emerge, but we want them to emerge as a responsible stakeholder and participant in an international system of rules and norms that work and aren't just zero-sum, like pre-World War I type of mercantilist approaches. And what's so jarring about Trump is that's what he's doing. He's doing a pre-World War I mercantilist approach that I think always leads inevitably to conflict of some sort. And so I would like to see us come back into TPP or something resembling it, because if we don't, the Chinese are going to write the rules for how the global economy operates, not us, because ultimately they're going to be a bigger market. If we think that we can cut off the technology supply chain with China, well, we're going to have a smaller team than they've got. They're going to have a bigger data set, which means they're going to have better technology than us. So we have to figure out a way to make this work interdependently, while not just kind of walking away.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question. There's a person right here. Yeah, right there.
Hi, my name is Ilary, and I'm a junior at the School of Foreign Service. Thank you so much for talking to us. And I had a question on the point you mentioned about the Paris Agreement and how this could play out for a potential agreement on the future of social media and the free speech there. Do you think it's possible for an agreement to be reached? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's an important. So the principle that in 2009 we went to Copenhagen, and the whole thing had fallen apart. The climate change summit in Copenhagen. And I remember Obama trying to figure out how we could salvage something, and going and forcing his way into the room where we thought the Chinese were. And I actually got physically pummeled by the Chinese security. And because they didn't want us in there, what they didn't want us to see is that they were chairing a meeting with India, Brazil, South Africa, and Russia. The Chinese were running the meeting. The point is that the Chinese had already risen. And what they had told the developing bloc is, why should we do something? The rich countries created this problem. Let them solve it. And that led to a principle that guided the Paris negotiations. Because we said to them, without you guys in the game, we can't do anything to solve this problem. So we called it common but differentiated responsibilities. Every country was going to have to do something, but we could define the different commitments that nations had. The rich countries were going to have to, everybody had emissions reduction targets, but the rich countries were going to have to do more faster, and we're going to have to pay into a fund to help the poorer countries. If you apply the common but differentiated model to different things, I think it can deal with particularly migration, and if you look at tech, if you look at tech and social media, I think it would probably take more the form of a regulatory type of agreement. But the fact of the matter is, if everybody in the world is accessing information on a set of tech platforms, they are going to be manipulated by bad actors. We're seeing this, and it's ripping apart countries. I mean, I think it's ripping apart our country. And we have strong institutions. I was just in Myanmar, where they went from 0% internet penetration basically to 95% in almost like 5 years. And the whole experience of the internet is on phones because people don't have computers, and it's all just through the Facebook app. And people who had no access to anything but government propaganda suddenly think they have a portal to everything, all the information on the internet, but all they're getting fed is hate speech about Muslims. If you want to know why what happened to the Rohingya is happening, it's in part because of that. So the point being is I think we have to set up a structure where the different countries of the world are coming to some agreement about information flow and not censorship, but knowing where the source of information, the source of certain information is. What are the standards by which certain information, certain actions by certain governments to target and interfere in the politics of another country, what are the norms that govern that? Like, what are the rules that Russia is even breaking? Right now, there are no rules that Russia's breaking. We need to establish them. So I think that'd be hard to get global agreement on. I think Russia and China wouldn't necessarily come in at the front end. But you may need to start with some smaller group of like-minded countries that agrees to a set of principles that you then try to add participants to, right? And actually, this began, the French tried to start this at the Paris Peace Conference last year. Like, what are some principles around that can govern the use of technology and social media? Because ultimately, you're going to need some framework that can start to address questions. Right now, it's social media. In 10 years, it'll be, or maybe not 10 years, 5 years, it'll be like facial recognition technology, right? And artificial intelligence. So there does need to be some version of a global agreement that figures out common and differentiated roles for different governments to play, regulatory arrangements, norms, dispute resolution mechanisms to deal with this. Because right now there's no architecture to deal with it.
Well, let's come back over here. Let's have the gentleman in the green shirt right there.
Hi, my name is Aiden Hughes. I recently finished my master's at the Mitchell Institute in Northern Ireland. I was hoping to ask a question about effective political communication and messaging. Something that I'm concerned about is how much more successful idea-driven politics seems to be over policy-driven politics. And we've seen that, that's an old problem, but I think it's really coming to the forefront right now. We saw that in 2016 with our election. I think you could make a case that it occurred in Brexit with their referendum. And a lot of people are suggesting that we're seeing it right now in the difference in success and enthusiasm between someone like Senator Warren and Pete Buttigieg. And I say that as a Mayor Pete fan. So my question is, how can we, or can we, make a policy-driven campaign and a policy-driven politics more consumable for the general public, people who aren't in this room, people who aren't policy wonks, and can sit down and understand and consume the full details of something like the TPP? How can we make that messaging more effective, or can we?
Not if it's not connected to a story. Obama used to tell me, you know, everything that we do is about telling a story about America and what America is. And it was actually interesting. It was after this kind of profile of me came out that I got a lot of grief for. And he said, like, you know what that thing got wrong? It made storytelling sound like a bad thing. He's like, storytelling, that's our entire job, is to tell a really good story about America. And what he meant by that is not in the speeches. Every speech we had, every policy we had, how we carried ourselves, how he presented himself, all had to add up to one story about what we were doing. And if you look at Barack Obama's effectiveness as a politician, his 2004 Democratic Convention speech that launched him is the exact same speech as his 2017 farewell address. You know, it's basically a message of progress, of essentially America succeeds when we have the principle that I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, that people of different backgrounds can come together to make positive change, right? That's the story. And underneath it, well, what flows from that story? Well, if that's your story, then you would want to provide people with affordable health care. And if that's your story, then you would see a role for the advancement of the marriage equality to the LGBT community. And many policies flow from that story. But you need to start with the story. If you start with the list of policies, nobody's going to listen to that list of policies. right now, the most important question in the world is there are two stories in competition. And one of them is like the oldest story in the book, right? The story that says, whatever the problems are, it's the fault of the people who are different, the Muslims or the immigrants or the gay people. There's a version of this story everywhere, in the United States and Israel and Hungary and Russia and in the Philippines and Brazil. That's their story. It's the reactionary story. We're going to go back in time. We're going to keep the immigrants out. We're going to bring back the old jobs. And there's no policy really behind it other than the policy rooted in grievance. We've got all these progressive policies, but we don't know what the story is. It's going to beat that story. And part of it is that we're like defensive about things. You go to Europe and it's like, I talk to progressives there, and their whole thing is about like, well, there are a lot of problems with the European Union, but we need it for X. You're going to lose the argument if that's your story. If there's some people over here saying the European Union is a disaster and all the problems are in Brussels, and the answer to that is there are a lot of problems with the European Union, but we need it for some things. Like, you're going to lose. Just like here, this just drive me crazy in the Iran agreement. Like, the Iran agreement is the biggest catastrophe in the history of the world. And then these Democrats would be like, oh, well, I have lots of concerns about the Iran agreement, but it's like, guys, if the voters are going to choose the person who most stridently opposes it. So part of this is also like body language and saying like, here's what I believe. Like, I believe, like here's a crazy idea. Like, I believe that globalization is good. Like, I believe that the free movement of people and the free movement of goods is important. I believe you can't put this back in a box. And I believe, I'm not saying this is a story, but this is what I believe, right? People need to know where you actually stand and sense that it's authentic and that you have a story. And our story is that first of all, if we go down that road, we're probably all going to die, either in the war or in the climate change that these guys are bringing on, right? But our story has to be about the fact that an inclusive approach to our societies and our world is ultimately what's going to bring people opportunity, and what ultimately is going to give people a safety net, and what ultimately is going to allow people to resolve their differences peacefully. Like, it's a better story. But we're not telling it. And you're not going to tell it with just a college affordability plan, and you're not going to tell it by just attacking the other side, and you're sure as hell not going to tell it if you're so busy holding other progressives to purity tests. Like, we're in a life or death struggle here for the meaning of our democracy and the survival of like the Enlightenment, right? So let's get behind a story that can work, and the policies will flow from that. I guarantee you they will. But let's not shoot machine guns at people based on whether they're for like a Medicare for all or a Medicare buy-in option. Like, we've got bigger enemies to take on. Sorry, I'm not mad at you.
I'm going to retract my statement about sermons. That actually was a very good one, so I repent. Well, I'm going to call the last question. So I'm looking back somewhere in the back quadrant. How about this gentleman right here? You're on the border. Well, I'm sorry. I was talking about this guy up here, but never mind. You got the microphone. You're in charge.
Thank you.
So please.
Charles Simmons. I'm a national security consultant and a writer for GPI. I do foreign policy pieces. Quick question for you. Just Iran said today they'd like to do a hostage exchange. Do you think this is just them trying to see if the administration is going to play ball? And let's assume the administration's not going to play ball. How much longer can the policy of provocation continue to go on before Iran does something and the administration looks at it as a way to substantiate a counter response?
Yeah, so I'm a cynic on this, and I kind of believe that the administration's entire policy is intended to try to provoke Iran to do something that will give them a pretext to enter into a military conflict with Iran. That's what I see, because they're just stacking up designating the IRGC, stacking up the sanctions, annexing recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights. Like, they're just trying to push every button they can, I think, to get Iran to do something that they can then respond to. That's what this feels like to me, this policy of maximum pressure. And And the Iranians have been like oddly restrained in a way. The fact that they're still in compliance with the JCPOA is kind of shocking to me, but I don't know how much longer that can hold. So on the hostage piece, I think the Iranians, part of what they are probably figuring out is what the Trump administration is doing is really unpopular in places like Europe and China and well, everywhere. And the Iranians, want those countries to keep buying their oil and want those countries to keep kind of not cooperating with our sanctions. And they may be just trying to find ways to look reasonable. They may have that international audience in mind as much as us. I'm not on the inside, so I don't know the particularities of what they could even offer in terms of hostage exchange. But I would imagine that may be part of it, because there's a game being played for global public opinion as well. And I'm pretty worried and pessimistic about this, though, because I'll give you some other, you want to hear some other things that could, I don't know why we closed our consulate in Basra. It was very weird to me. I don't think the security situation there is worse than it was at other times during the war when we had a consulate there. But if we entered into a military conflict in Basra, the Iranians could take that thing out immediately, right? I find it weird that there's not a Secretary of Defense nominee. It's been like 5 months. By all counts, Mattis, hawk that he is, was a break on doing something with Iran. I think institutionally, the Pentagon would be very cautious because they know the cost of that war. Maybe they don't want a strong voice at the table for the Department of Defense when it comes to Iran and Venezuela. So here I'm veering up to conspiracy theory, but it just feels like there's a lot of smoke around a desire to have a conflict, but they can't really have it unless the Iranians do something. They can't just like wake up and bomb Iran. So that worries me. And the Iranians probably know that, which probably suggests why thus far they've been restrained. But maintaining that for another year and a half is going to be tricky.
So,
sorry to end on a downer.
No,
I gave this great sermon. No.
A couple of housekeeping points. Ben is going to be signing copies of the book up here, and we ask that you form a line down this side. And please don't cut through, but stop here at the step, and we'll get the table up and get that organized. But secondly, join me in thanking Ben for an amazing conversation.